Okay, well, we're going to finish the book of Job tonight. And so, just kind of refreshing ourselves on breaking down the book of Job. First two chapters, you're looking there at Job's affliction, at the suffering that he is going through at the hands of Satan. First, all of his material possessions are taken away, and then, of course, his family, his children all die. And then Satan comes in and asks God to further afflict him by afflicting him with sores and boils, and we see Job sitting in just a rubbish heap. And all he can do is just scrape at those sores with a shard of clay, a potsherd. And so then, after we get to see what just horrendous circumstances Job is in, we're introduced to his three friends. And that takes up the bulk of the book, all the way through chapter 37. And all three of his friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, they each talk to him, and as they talk, all of them have a different tact, but the same issue, which is, Job, you must have done something wrong. And no matter how they argue it, they can't seem to get past this idea that the only reason you suffer would be if you've done something wrong. God is punishing Job for something. He's got to. And their whole worldview is tied around this idea that it is only the wicked that suffer. And of course, as they bring this up over and over and over again, Job says time and time and time again, what have I done wrong? Where's my sin? Show me and I'll fix it. And eventually, they poke at Job so much that Job begins to now go beyond just saying, look, I haven't done anything wrong, to saying, I haven't done anything wrong, and if I could argue with God, if He'd let me, I'd win the debate. And that's, of course, where he oversteps his bounds. And so, as we've been going through the book, you look at Job's three friends, and there was really only one thing they did right. And Job says it time and time again. When you guys came to see me, there's only one thing that you've said that actually brought me comfort. What was the one thing they said? They said nothing. That was the thing they did. When they said nothing, when they just sat with him, he said, that brought me comfort. And they did that at the beginning for quite some time, days in fact. But then when they began to speak, Job says, you're just heaping burdens on me. You're trying to fix my problem by showing me what I'm doing wrong. But let's be fair about this. Was there any fixing Job's problem? No. You couldn't fix it. You couldn't take the sickness away. Couldn't bring his children back. There was nothing to do to fix this man's problems. And yet, that's what they were trying to do. And Job says, every time you try and show me how it could be better, really all you're doing is stabbing me. You're hurting me. Which is a big lesson of the book of Job. When people are hurting, there is a time for solutions, and there's a time to just say, I'm here. I'm here for you. I'm your friend. And I can't do anything about this, but just know that I care about you. And that's what Job said. Now is not the time to tell me how to fix this, because you can't fix it. And so Job told him, he even said, even if I have done something wrong, what should you give me? Comfort. Even if I've done something wrong, now's the time for comfort. And so that really is the bulk of it. And then right there at the end, we were introduced to one more guy, Elihu. And he comes in, and he's another one of Job's friends, but he hasn't said a word up to this point. We haven't heard of him at all. But he begins to speak, and he's the guy we kind of say, well, what he said was for the most part right. Because he's the guy who said, well, wait a second. There are times people suffer, and they haven't done anything wrong. And he makes the statement, he says that God rewards each man for his righteousness according to his own way. In other words, God is going to reward Job if he's righteous, but not necessarily in a way that we would expect. And there's a lot of truth to that. You go through the Bible and you look at person after person after person that served God, and really the majority of them suffered quite a bit in life. But then you look at the end of the story and you say, but they were blessed. God in some way made that thing to work out for good. David running around in the wilderness from Saul turned out for good. Ruth and losing her husband and losing her father-in-law and all of those things turned out for good. Esther and all the affliction she went through and the fear for her life turned out for good. And you can just go through really almost every single person in the Bible, and you can say, well, look at that. When they were faithful, it looked like a punishment, but it turned out for good. And that was Elihu's point. Now, the one thing we said about him is Elihu was pretty sharp with his words with Job, and that's where you get that debate over, is this guy a good guy or a bad guy? And I gave the evidence there that you can look at it either way and come up with your own opinion on that. But no matter what, some of the things Elihu said were correct. We don't always suffer just because we've done the wrong thing. And then we're now in the end of the book. Starting in chapter 38, God answers Job. And it says He answers him out of the whirlwind. And so we want to kind of keep that in mind, the tenor of God's speech. Because there are some times that you can read in the Bible and God is really gentle and really comforting in the way that He talks to somebody. This is not one of those times. When He speaks to Job, He speaks to him out of the whirlwind, out of the tempest. It's with great fervor and great fear, just like when He spoke at Mount Sinai and there were the earthquakes and the fire and everybody was scared. That's the way God is speaking to Job. Now, any questions before we get back into the text? Okay, so quick reminder of what we've covered so far of God's response. The bulk of God's response is just going to come down to one thing. Job, you do not know what you're talking about. You are talking about things that you're ignorant with. And God gives him lots of examples. He talks about the tides and how He sets the barriers for the tides. And you think about if we have a tsunami, how much damage that does. Well, the reason we don't have tsunamis every day is because of God setting those borders. He put that moon in just the right spot and it controls those tides. He talks about the sun and the great power and the heat of it and how it comes by at just the right time. And we have just the right amount of sun and not too much. If the sun just stopped in the sky for too long, we'd burn up on one side and freeze on the other. And God sets the seasons and all those sorts of things. God talks about heaven and hell. He talks about death. And here's a big one that even today with all of our science, see, it's funny, a lot of the things we're talking about here, we look at it and we say, oh man, we know a lot more than Job did, and yet we still don't know much. But here's one, with all of our science, how much do we know about what's on the other side of death? You don't know any more than Job did. You know nothing. And God tells him, He says, Job, do you know about death? Do you know what stands at those gates? Do you know what happens when something dies, when somebody dies? And so He just hammers Job one time after another with questions that Job has to admit, everyone has to admit, I know nothing. He talks about lightning and how God makes a pathway in the sky for that lightning. He talks about the food chain, and here's all these animals that God takes care of. And I gave an example. This is how we describe the food chain to a child. I was working at the zoo. This is what we use. We'd say, here's the food chain. You got the little bitty phytoplankton, then moves the zooplankton. You get the little fish, then to the big fish, and then that's what the whales eat. And we just described it like that. Well, this is what an actual food web looks like. It's just so mind-bogglingly complicated. Nobody can wrap their brain around how interconnected everything is. You talk about, last 15 minutes before class, we were talking about the oil spill. And you think about the impact on that environment. Does anybody have any idea what kind of impact that's going to have on the environment? No. The smartest guys on the planet have no idea. They can't even begin to fathom what's going to happen because of it. And that's because all the interconnection that we have in ecosystems are so complex that really it shouldn't work at all. What's the general rule of thumb? That the more complicated something becomes, the easier it is to break down, right? Isn't that the rule of thumb? The more moving parts, the more problems you're going to have. How many moving parts are there in our environment? And yet God says, I hold it together. Well, why doesn't everything just fall apart? Because God holds it together. This very complicated organism that we have of this universe, God holds together with the might of His wisdom. So He says, Job, how do all these animals get taken care of? We talked about the mountain goat and threw up this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures. It makes me laugh. Guy took this picture and he had to leave because he sat there, I think it was 6-8 hours, he sat there waiting for that mountain goat to move on to the next thing, and he never did. He just sat there licking that salt rock. And God says, take the mountain goat. Do you know where the mountain goat goes to give birth? Well, the answer is no. Why? Because nobody could follow that thing. Right? They go up on the cliffs and the rocks and just unbelievable. It talks about ostrich, the ostrich egg. And ostrich, these pictures are exactly the way ostriches lay their eggs. They lay them right there on the ground and then they leave. So you have these giant eggs, just a giant dinner waiting for any animal to come by. And they have a major problem with poaching with ostrich eggs because of this, because it's real easy to poach an ostrich egg. You just walk over, bend down, pick it up, and walk off. And God says, they lay their eggs because they're idiots. He says, I took all their wisdom away. They're dumb. They laid them right there on the ground so that anything could trample over them, and yet the ostrich survives. What keeps the dumb ostrich alive? The same God that makes sure that babies reach adulthood. Have you ever thought about that with little kids? How many bumps and bruises and falls do little kids take? My kid should be blind like 9 times over. For the time she's fallen and almost hit her, knocked her eye out, or, scrapes and bumps and stitches. And we joke about it. We say, by the grace of God, children reach adulthood. By the grace of God, ostriches have another generation. And it's God holding the whole thing together. And that's his point to Job. He says, Job, do you know about any of this stuff? And Job, of course, is going to have to admit the same thing we'd have to admit, which is, I don't know what I'm talking about. He talks about the war horses and the eagle. And he talks about the war horse, and here's this horse and has no fear. And it goes into battle with such strength and fervor, and it's not afraid of the spear. It's not afraid of the battle sounds. And God's point there is, if I can make an animal that has no fear, that is that powerful, that will go into war, how powerful do you think I am? It's a scary thought, isn't it? And they talk about the eagle, and he says, and he actually talks about hawks, and I just give one bird of prey as an example, the eagle, because we're so familiar with it. And talk about how they build these giant nests. Eagles build 1-ton nests. If you tried to build a nest in a tree that weighed 1 ton, you'd break the tree. You'd never do it. But eagles do it all the time. No problem whatsoever. And they have eyesight where they can see this vast distance, so fly way up there and then dive bomb down and grab a salmon right out of the water. Who made them that way? God. And so here's all this wilderness, all this life in this universe, and God is in control of it, and He's keeping it all together. He says, I really know what I'm doing. Anybody have any questions on that before we move into new material at this point? Okay. Next thing we're going to look at is there's 2 animals he gives an example of. Now, one of them is the behemoth. So let's look here at the behemoth for a second. Chapter 40, verse 15. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. So you've got to talk about this animal. Now, I want you to look at the description here of this animal. Look now at the behemoth, which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. So he's an herbivore. See, now his strength is in his hips. His power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. His ribs like bars of iron. So here's this animal with this great stout middle section of its body. Great tail like a cedar. Bones like bronze. Ribs like iron. He says he is the first of the ways of God. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. In other words, he's so big, nobody tries to attack him. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a covert of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the river may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth. Though he takes it in his eyes, or one pierces his nose with a snare. In other words, no matter what you do to him, what's he going to do? He's just going to shrug you off. Now, most people most Bibles, when you get to verse 15 where it says, look now at the behemoth, there's an asterisk or something. And like I've got, I like what it says in mine. It says, a large animal with exact identity unknown. Now that's, I think, accurate. But raise your hand if your Bible says that it's maybe a hippopotamus. Okay, you got that one? Hippopotamus, what's the other one there? Elephant, not hippopotamus or an elephant. Okay, we got elephant. Okay, now, before we go any farther, I want you to just think about it for a second. Does this description match a hippopotamus? Not even close. Does it match an elephant? No. I have up here this little cartoon that I saw one time, and it made me laugh because this is exactly what it is. It says, he has a tail like a cedar. And then you start thinking about that hippopotamus with that wonderful tail like a cedar. Or the elephant with a tail like a cedar. The reason that's in the footnotes is because somebody said, we've got to find an animal that matches this, that we know of, that's living. And so the closest they could think of was a hippo or an elephant. But really, as that picture shows up there, what does that sound a lot like? It sounds like a dinosaur. And so your Bible, I use this all the time when people say, well, what about the dinosaurs? What does God say about the dinosaurs? Well, first of all, the Bible's not a naturalist book. It's not here to describe every species ever created. But the Bible doesn't ignore dinosaurs either. Well, here, I think this is a great description of an animal that sounds exactly like a dinosaur. And so you look at it and you say, well, what happened to the dinosaurs? Well, pretty much everybody thinks that this book was written after the days of Noah. We don't know for sure, but after. Well, that tells you, were there dinosaurs after Noah? Yeah. As far as we can tell, right? And so the point being is, your Bible it's not there to tell you about dinosaurs. Right? God didn't write the Bible so that you'd find out about dinosaurs. But they don't ignore them. It's not like there's some giant contradiction there. And so here, you want to call it a brontosaurus or diplodocus or whatever you want to call it, this sounds a lot more like a dinosaur than it does like a hippo. Anybody have any questions? Okay. Next one we'll look in chapter 41 is the Leviathan. Now this is some artist's rendition of it, but once again, you look at the Leviathan and that looks a lot more like a dinosaur, right? An extinct sea creature than it does like anything that we have around us today. It says, can you draw out Leviathan with a hook or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? So all of these are questions where the answer to it is no, right? Can you just throw a fishing line in there and catch this guy? No. Can you just pierce his jaw with a hook? No. Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Can you just come up to this Leviathan and just not worry about it hurting you? Oh no, you need to be scared. This is a giant beast. Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Can you tame him? That's the point. Can you domesticate this animal? No. Will you play with him as with a bird, or will you leash him for your maidens? No. Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Okay, so do people catch this guy and eat him? No. Can you fill his skin with harpoons or his head with fishing spears? No. Lay your hand on him, remember the battle, never do it again. I love that one because it just, that lays the whole thing out there right there. If you ever do go to battle with this guy, you will remember it. You will never, ever do it again. And so, indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? There's the point right there. You catch what he's been saying? He's been talking about this Leviathan. Well, why is the Leviathan important? Here's this giant beast. Nobody can hunt him. Nobody can tame him. Nobody is willing to risk their life to go out after this. If you do battle him, people are going to shake their head and say you're dumb. And because he's so strong. And God says, if you can't tackle that, how strong do you think his creator is? Because the thing created is always weaker than the creator, right? The creator is always bigger than the thing it creates. And so he says, verse 11, who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. All of this here is mine. I'll do with it what I want. It's mine. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, or his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? I think it's an interesting thing here, just kind of fun thing to note. But verse 12, here's this giant, unbelievable creature. Nobody can hunt it. It's just huge beyond proportions. And then look at what it says. He has mighty power and he has graceful proportions. Have you ever noticed that? How God can make these giant things and yet they can be wonderfully gracious? You take something like a blue whale, which is the largest animal we can think of, and you have a blue whale and just unbelievable size, and yet you watch them and they're just grace personified. It's just absolutely unbelievable. That's what our Creator can do. And so he says, you can't open this guy's mouth. You can't remove his outer coat. You can't put a bridle on him. Verse 15, his rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. So here's these scales, and they're so tightly put together, there's no way you could wedge anything between the armor. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lights, sparks of fire shoot out. Now you do with that what you will, but when you read that in verse 18 and 19, what does that sound like? It sounds like he spit fire. That's what it sounds like. Now it might just be, see, here's the problem. We don't know what this animal looks like. So it could be some sort of poetical sort of statement, but that looks a lot like he's saying this thing can shoot fire. Well, once again, I don't want to get into some giant debate over the thing, but it makes you wonder. You look through history and you see all these pictures of dragons and things like that, and people talk about dragons. You see, well, where did dragons come from? Well, if there was a beast at one point in time that could shoot fire out of its mouth, that'd be a good place to start, wouldn't it? And so just a point of interest. Verse 20, smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck and sorrow dances before him. Now don't get in front of this guy. Sorrow dances before him. You're going to be dead. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They're firm on him, cannot be moved. His heart is as hard as stone, even as hard as the lower millstone. When he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid because of his crashings. They are beside themselves. So here it is. He crashes through the water, and what happens? Massive waves that upturn boats. He regards iron as, verse 26, a sword reaches him, it cannot avail, nor to spear, dart, or javelin. He regards iron as straw, bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. Sling stones become like stubble to him. Darts are regarded as straw. He laughs at the thread of javelins. His undersides are like sharp potsherds. He spreads pointed marks in the mire. Starting to get the point, right? He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. He leaves a shining wake behind him. One would think the deep had white hair. On earth there is nothing like him which is made without fear. He beholds every high thing. He is king over all the children of pride. Or there's all these strong predator animals that can have pride, and he's king of them all. Now, God gives this big description, which is just fascinating to me. You know, coming from the zoo background that I have, I read through that, and it's fascinating. But blow all that aside for a second. What's the point? He's telling Job something. Here's this mighty beast. You wouldn't go near it. Job, you've been saying, God, you come up and you stand right here and I'll argue my point with you. And God says, Job, if Leviathan did something to you, would you do that? If the Leviathan upset your boat, would you say, hey, Leviathan, get over here, I got a point to argue with you? Or would you run? Right? That's his point. I am Jehovah. I am great. And Job, you better watch your tongue before you come before the mighty one. And there's a lesson there. Because no matter how bad things get in our life, we have to always remember to show respect for God. Because no matter what, He's greater than the Leviathan. No matter what, He is the great I am. And so here he gives these two animals as a description. It says, I made those things. I breathed them into being. If I can make stuff like that, you do not want to tangle with me. And it's a very good point. We forget sometimes. We talk about people shaking their fist at God or rebelling against Him, and we talk about sin. We live in a world where sin is very easy to engage in. It's very easy to do, and we forget. For every sin, you're going to be held accountable. For everything we do, you're going to stand before the great I Am, who's scarier than the Leviathan, got more power than the behemoth. We got to watch our tongues, watch the way we live, watch the way we talk. And God says, on one hand, I am your Father and I love you, but on the other hand, just as much as a father loves us and cares for us, there's that point where your dad gives you that look and you just kind of shut your mouth. Right? That's what he's saying to Job. Job, I bared with you, but no more. You got to stop this. You're going down the trail that you shouldn't travel. Any questions on those two sections there? Okay. And what we're going to do is look here in chapter 42. Now, as we go through chapter 42, we're going to finish the book up. And really, if you want to look at the whole thing, it'll be summed up in verse 3. Job's going to start in verse 1 saying, Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do everything, and that no purpose of yours can be withheld from you. You asked, who is this who hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Now here's Job, and you want to take all the things that Job has been saying. I would argue my point with God. I'm righteous, and He's forgotten about me, or He's mistreated me, or He made a mistake with me, even though He rarely makes mistakes. He did this time. At the end of it, he says, I'm going to shut my mouth. I shouldn't have said those things because I spoke out of my ignorance. I spoke out of something I didn't understand. And I think there's just a huge lesson in that statement alone, because really that's the culmination of the book of Job. How many times have we as human beings spoken where we did not understand? Whenever somebody says, well, I just think that God should, you just stop right there. I've said those statements. There are times where we speak out of our ignorance. I don't see why sin should be that big of a deal, right? I don't see why is it so important that somebody be saved through Jesus only? There are good people who are Buddhists. Just stop for a second. I don't understand. That's what we need to say is, I don't understand. I am not in a position to understand how those things work. If God tells me that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then that's what it is. And the same thing is true on the other side. There are times where God says, I forgive you, and we go, oh, He would never forgive me. I'm just such a low life. I've just made so many mistakes. I've blown it so many times. You don't know. If you knew how many bad things I've done, you would never, ever, ever think I was going to heaven. And you just stop right there. You're speaking out of your ignorance. You're speaking about something you don't know. God says, I forgive. I remember your sins no more. Now, I can't comprehend that. I cannot comprehend how God could look at my life and the dumb things I've done and the dumb things I've said and the hurtful things and the things, a God who can be in our heads. Isn't that a scary thought, that He's in our heads? He knows what you're thinking. A God that would know all the things that we've thought, that He would ever forgive and remember our sins no more. I can't comprehend it, but I just need to understand that's the way it is. Because I'm speaking of something I don't understand. See, it works on both sides, doesn't it? If we go over here and we say, I know better than God, it should work like this, just shut your mouth. If you're over here and you say, no, I don't believe God. When He tells me I'm forgiven, or when He tells me that baptism saves me, I don't believe it. I don't believe something as simple as that could save me. You just shut your mouth. You don't know what you're talking about. None of us do. Because once again, just like God said to Job, have you seen the gates of hell? Have you gone and stood where death is? Do you know what it's like on the other side? None of us do. So we're just going to have to take the words of the one who created it all. And when he says, this is the way it works, sometimes you just got to accept that's the way it works. Anybody have any questions? Okay, and so Job makes it clear. He says, God, every purpose you have, nobody withholds it from you. And if you do everything so well and nobody can withhold your purpose from you, then that is what is. And he says, verse 4, listen, please, and let me speak. You said, I will question you, and you shall answer me. Remember how Job had been saying, I would question you, God. I would argue with God. And then God came in that whirlwind, and he said, Job, I got some questions for you, and you answer those to me. And that's what all those chapters have been. Job says, that's what you said, God. And they said, verse 5, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. Now you think about this for a second. When Job says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you, that's kind of like when we say, I knew what you were talking about, but now I get it, right? You know how there's those things where little kids and their parents tell them the same lesson over and over and over again, and then when the kid actually touches the hot stove, then he gets it? That's what Job is saying. He says, I heard of you from the ear. I heard of how great you were, and I heard of how wonderful you were, and how strong you were, and how wise you were, but now my eyes have seen it. Now I get it. Now that one thing, if that is all that Job got out of all that suffering, it was worth it. Because after Job has seen God, and I'm not talking about physically seeing Him, but I mean he gets it. He gets what God's all about. He gets how powerful God is. He gets that God really does take care of His children. You know how we go through life like that and we say, oh yeah, I know God takes care of me. I know God will take care of me. And you think you mean it until something really bad happens in your life, and then you realize you need to start learning how to mean it. That's what Job's saying here. I got it now. And that's the only thing he got out of this. It was worth it. Because once you get it, once you understand what God really is, who He really is, how powerful He is and how loving He is and how in control He is, you never turn back. There is no road back to being a heathen after that. And so Job says, I get it. I get it. No more. My shame is full. I get it. And so it says in verse 7, and so it was after the Lord had spoken these words to Job that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now you pause there just for a second. We just got done talking about how Job had been wrong, right? See how I told you this is not a linear book? There's no pure good guy and pure bad guy, meaning a good guy being somebody who always says something right all the time, and there's no people who say wrong things all the time. Well, Job had made this mistake, but overall, what did Job always say? God is great. God is the true God. I'll worship Him. And he says, you guys have said things that aren't true. And God says, my wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you've not spoken of me what is right. They said things about God that weren't true. Because really, if you take and you do what these three guys did, we go around and every time somebody is hurting, we tell them, you know why you're hurting? Because God's mad at you. Now, you're going to be right some of the time. Some people, some of the time, are hurting because God is upset and disciplining them. But if you say that to every person, you are not properly representing God, are you? What you're actually doing is you're getting people to think of God as this God that just is vindictive and mean and is always just stabbing at people. And that's what he says to these three guys. He says, you guys are really making me mad because you're not saying things that are true about me. You're defaming my name, right? It's no different than slander, what they've been saying. Because there are lots of people on the planet suffering, and they know that they haven't done anything wrong, and they go, well, God hates me. He must not be a good God. Because no matter what they said to Job, they were never going to convince Job that he'd done something wrong, were they? Remember how we saw that over and over and over again? Job says, I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't done anything wrong at all. They weren't going to convince him he'd done something wrong because he knew he hadn't. So if they had ever convinced Job that God was punishing him because Job was a bad guy, really all they would have done is convince Job that God was bad. And God was vindictive and mean. And so God says, my wrath is aroused against you because you have spoken to me you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now therefore take for yourselves 7 bulls and 7 rams, go to my servant Job and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job shall pray for you. For I will accept him, lest I deal with you according to your folly, because you have not spoken to me what is right, as my servant Job has. So go, repent, offer sacrifices. And so Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord commanded them, for the Lord had accepted Job. And the Lord restored Job's losses when he prayed for his friends. Indeed, the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. And all his brothers and all his sisters and all those who had been his acquaintances before came to him and ate food with him in his house, and they consoled him and comforted him for all the adversity that the Lord had brought upon him. Each one gave him a piece of silver and each a ring of gold. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, for he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, 1,000 female donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first Jemimah, the name of the second Keziah, the name of the third Karen Hapuk. In all the land were found no women so beautiful as the daughters of Job, and their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. And after this, Job lived 140 years and saw his children and grandchildren for 4 generations. So Job died old and full of days. Now you think about that. That last part is put in there for us, so that we would know God is righteous, and that for all that Job went through, God still took care of him. Job suffered for a season in a way that no man really has ever suffered since. But at the end of that, when he finally got it, when the light bulb turned on in Job's mind and he understood, and he says, I've been hearing, but now I see, then everything got better. And so it's really a beautiful thing when you think of the book of Job in that sense, that it's not only a book that tells us how to comfort people who are suffering, but it's also a book that tells us when we suffer, you will get through it. There is an other side to this story. There is a happy ending to the whole thing. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Yeah.
Down in verse 11 where it says his friends came comforting him.
Mm-hmm.
For all the evil that Jehovah had brought upon him.
Word could also mean adversity. So he's just saying for all the suffering he went through.
Jehovah didn't bring it on.
Okay, so here's our problem. Yeah. God, if you're going to say it, and there's 2 ways to say God brings adversity on people. One way you can say it would be wrong, which is God tempts people. Now, James says very clearly, God does not tempt people to do what's evil. Satan did the tempting. But in another sense, who did Satan get the power from to take all those things away from Job? He got it from God. God allowed it, yeah. And so God wasn't tempting Job to do evil. As a matter of fact, what did God give Job at the end of the whole thing? He gave him more, and he gave him a wisdom he couldn't have had any other way. So God wasn't tempting him, but did God bring adversity on him? Yes. And so the key with this, we have to understand God's intentions were a positive, Satan's were a negative. God never has those negative intentions. And that's why, like yours where it says the evil, that word, that's kind of a King Jamesy way to say it. And we think of the word evil as bad, but in that sense all it means is adversity. Trials, struggles is all that's meant in that phrase there, not evil like what Satan wanted. Does that help? Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Is there any indication on how old Job was when he went through this?
How old he was when he went through it? No, I don't believe there is. That we don't get any. You're talking about like a starting date when it began and everything?
Yeah, or how old were people living at that time?
No, we don't. See, this is the problem is, like I said at the beginning of class, one of my best guesses is that it was during the time of the judges. But the problem with that is most people during the judges weren't living this long. So that's evidence against my point of view. And the reason I say it's my point of view is nobody really knows where we date this. I mean, we just don't know where to put the book in the context of things. It would sound like Job lived a long, healthy life when it says 140 years, though, because just kind of the context seems to point out he didn't die short. After his life wasn't cut short, he lived to a good old age is kind of the intention, which means this was a time where 140 years would have been a long lifespan. Gene? Nope? Okay. Anybody else have any questions? Okay. Yes?
Kind of a follow-up on Mitchell's point. God allows man to live in the environment where Satan tempts us.
Mm-hmm.
That environment. So that would be another way in which God brings adversity upon us. He allows that environment. But in allowing that environment to exist where both the evil and the good dwell together, he proves both sides. If we remain faithful, there's only one way to prove it, and that's by resisting the temptation that God allows us to live around.
Right.
And it also proves the evil of Satan, so that when all is done, nobody will be able to argue, that they're not bad or otherwise.
Yeah. Gene's point, I don't know how many people are able to hear it, but is that by even letting us live on this planet that has good and evil in it, God is allowing us to go through adversity. But, over in the book of Ezekiel it says, God doesn't desire any of the wicked to perish. Why does God have us live on this planet? He wants you to choose Him and go to spend eternity with Him in heaven. And that's what He's wanting to uphold. Satan, on the other hand, what does he want? The devouring lion. He wants to eat you up. And so, absolutely. God allows us to live here, and He upholds good while we do live here. And you can contrast good versus evil here on this planet. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to just stop here. We're a few minutes early, but I'm not going to get into the book of Psalms with only 3 minutes or 4 minutes left. So we'll just stop there. Next week we'll begin to go through Psalms for the summer quarter here.